Oil prices are greatly affected by world events. Today, the Department of Justice has indicted Nicolas Maduro and 14 of his constituents. And what's interesting is that we just put new sanctions on Iran, making their lives even more miserable, even more than they already are. And these are two of Russia's biggest allies. It's going to be interesting to see how this affects Russia and how they retaliate, and if we've put out millions of dollars reward for anything that leads up to the arrest of Nicolas Maduro. This is very interesting. So I'm Sean Pruitt, president of Kingdom Exploration. I invested in my first oil well 25 years ago, and I pay attention to the news and how it affects my industry. So if you like this channel and you're interested in learning more about world events and how it affects oil prices, please subscribe to my channel.
Russian jets bombing Syria. Images like these are commonplace since Russia decided to enter the war in support of the Assad regime last September. But these jets have come from Iran, a first for Moscow and for Tehran, which had not authorized the use of its bases by an outside force since 1979. Though undoubtedly a tactical and logistical advantage for Russia, the two powers' main interests are clearly political. In recent days, the two have stepped up meetings and declarations. These historic allies of Damascus who wish to keep Assad in power now represent a powerful front. Their support for the Syrian regime is unequivocal. Alaueddin Borojerdi is head of the Iranian Parliamentary Commission on National Security and Foreign Policy. Because Syrian people stand on the first line of resistance, we stand by Syria's side. We came here to announce our support for Syria. Standing shoulder to shoulder with Russia brings Iran back onto the world stage in a show of force. For Russia, a powerful comeback in the geopolitical focal point of the Middle East is at stake. Stopping radical Sunni Islam is essential for Moscow. Predominantly Shiite Iran seemingly won't threaten Russia's interests in the former republics of the Caucasus. Moscow has everything to gain from a strong axis formed with Iran and Turkey. Their sights are certainly set on counterbalancing US influence in the region. Andrew Tabler is from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy.
This marks the first time that Russia has based out of Iran, and marks an escalation in terms of the fight in Syria, not necessarily militarily, but in terms of the Russian alignment with Iran in places like Syria. And we can see very clearly that the Russians are playing a very strong political cards in places like Syria, while the United States is at best playing defense.
With this backdrop, the tension between Moscow and Ankara could not have lasted. Reconciliation is therefore underway. Iran welcomed this tripartite axis despite its historical enmity for Ankara. Unprecedented alliances are emerging to ward off Western influence in the region. Professor Hussein Bajeh is from the Middle East Technical University.
Mistrust, I would say, from Turkish side to Americans, to NATO, and to Europeans altogether, and showing more trust to Putin. It is something new in our relations.
The US will see this tripartite alliance as a significant threat to its dominance in the region, though Moscow has said that it is close to a deal with Washington on closer cooperation between them in Syria.
Iran and Russia have little in common along cultural, ethnic, and religious lines. Iran is an Islamic republic, while Russia has a long history of secularism. Yet the two are close geopolitical allies for one simple reason: the United States. Conflict throughout the Middle East and Central Asia has pit the U.S. against both Iran and Russia, as all three seek greater power in these regions. So what exactly makes up the alliance between Russia and Iran, and what does it have to do with the U.S.? Well, notably, Russia and Iran have both held unfriendly relations with the United States for decades. For Iran, this began largely due to a CIA-backed coup, which replaced the appointed prime minister with a U.S.-friendly Shah in 1953. Roughly 26 years later, the Shah was overthrown in the Islamic Revolution, ending U.S. relations. As for Russia, negative and competing relations with the United States following World War II ultimately culminated in a half-century-long Cold War, lasting until the fall of the Soviet Union, although political disagreements between them continue to this day. As such, the U.S. has placed economic sanctions on both countries, most recently in Iran for violating details of an agreement on nuclear proliferation, and in Russia for the invasion of Crimea in Ukraine. In light of these sanctions, the two countries were forced to rely on each other for certain types of trade, like oil. In fact, in recent years, they've worked on an oil for goods deal that could be worth as much as $20 billion and would help Iran dispense with its excess of oil. Since the two share a border via the Caspian Sea, they're able to cooperate militarily as well. Russia's Collective Security Treaty Organization, which serves as an affront to NATO and features predominantly post-Soviet states, has invited Iran to join. Additionally, the two are primary founders of the Gas Exporting Countries Forum, which represents roughly 70% of the world's natural gas. Due to military sanctions against Iran, the country also relies on Russia for armaments. In 2010, a UN resolution banned the sale of missile systems and other heavy weaponry to Iran, forcing Russia to go back on a deal for long-range surface-to-air missiles. However, following completion of the Iran nuclear deal between Iran and the United Nations Security Council, the missile delivery was reinstated. The two countries also work together on security, particularly against ISIS. The so-called 4+1 coalition, made up of Russia, Syria, Iran, Iraq, and Lebanon, have shared intelligence in order to fight the terror group. However, the United States has pushed back on this coalition, saying it aids not just anti-ISIS efforts, but pro-Syria efforts, particularly by Russia and Iran. Both have been allies of the Syrian government for decades. By some accounts, Iran is more of a pawn for Russia to wield its influence rather than a fully equal partner in their relationship. One thing is certain, however, this generally favorable relationship has done plenty to rebuff the United States, while both Iran and Russia see mutually beneficial results from their alliance.
Breaking tonight, Russia trying to tighten its grip as we speak on Venezuela, in total defiance of the United States' demand that Russia vacate the socialist dictatorship. There are new reports this evening that Russia is sending even more troops to the region. You know, not since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 have we had such an enemy presence in our own hemisphere. And how we deal with Vladimir Putin down there is former Trump Deputy National Security Advisor, KT McFarland. All right, so what's your advice here? What's your advice and what are you hearing from the administration in terms of how you approach this? Because this is, you know, this is a little different than Syria. This is right here in our hemisphere.
Yeah, this is.
You know, 3 hours from Miami, and we got a problem because all the bad guys are there. Being led, really, by the likes of Vladimir Putin, who's now sending, we have sources that are saying, some special forces into the region and possibly more. KT, how do we get Nicolas Maduro to go?
Well, first of all, understand that Putin doesn't care about Venezuela. He doesn't want to get stuck with that and rebuilding Venezuela. When they had Cuba, it practically broke them. So what he's doing in Venezuela is not establishing a military presence that he wants to build out. He's looking for a bargaining chip. He's looking for leverage. Now, what does he want back from that? In 1962, as you just pointed out, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, America had put nuclear weapons, missiles in Turkey that could be aimed at Russia. Well, they responded by sending nuclear weapons to Cuba. What did we do? How did we solve it? At the end of the day, the Russians left Cuba, and we took the missiles out of Turkey. So I think what Putin wants, he wants to trade. He's doing this because he wants us out of Ukraine, where President Trump has been very tough. You know, he imposed new sanctions on the Russians, and he's armed the Ukrainians with lethal weapons, and Putin doesn't like that.
Okay, so, you know, you guys are messing around in my backyard. I'm going to mess around in yours? Is that what this is? Tit for tat?
Yeah.
You look at this, it's the timing of it. It's spectacular, really, in terms of what Putin's doing, isn't it? We're on the knife edge of negotiations with Iran for the United States of America, and of course sanctions. Europe, they're due to run out in the summer.
Yeah. Well, what you have from Lavrov is saying that this was done in the spirit of goodwill, lifting this ban on the S-300 missile system. They insist that it's about stimulating progress in those very nuclear talks that concluded, at least the preliminary concluded April 2nd in Switzerland. And what Lavrov is insisting is that these missiles will not be pointed at Israel.
The S-300 is exclusively a defensive weapon which cannot serve offensive purposes and will not jeopardize the security of any country, including, of course, Israel.
The situation that has developed around the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action is a direct consequence of destructive steps taken by the U.S. administration, which has withdrawn from the agreement. Our American partners, with the support of some of their regional allies, are openly seeking to provoke Iran.
Well, the foreign ministers of Russia and Iran have met in Moscow seeking to breathe life into the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the formal name of a nuclear deal. Tensions over Iran's nuclear program were exacerbated after Washington unilaterally withdrew from the agreement in May of last year. It also slapped economic sanctions on Iran's oil exports. Iran says it could take a strong step at the end of this week.
Good evening, I'm Rena Nine, and this is our Western edition. Multiple drones bombed Saudi Arabia's largest oil facilities today. And tonight, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo accused Iran of launching the attack and ruled out a claim of responsibility by Yemeni rebels. The attack damaged the source of an estimated 8 million barrels of crude oil produced there every day. That's about 10% of the world's daily supply of crude oil. Here's Roxana Saberi.
Flames and black smoke filled the sky over the world's largest oil processing plant in Saudi Arabia this morning, spreading so far they could even be seen from space. Saudi Arabia confirmed the Abqaiq refinery and Khares oil field, the country's second biggest, were both hit by drone strikes. In neighboring Yemen, Houthi rebels claimed responsibility for the attack. The group's spokesman said the Houthis struck the two sites with 10 drones and warned of more attacks. The Iranian-backed Houthis have been at war with the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen since 2015. The brutal conflict has pushed Yemen to the brink of famine and turned the country into what the UN calls the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Lately, that war has stretched into Saudi Arabia, with rebels repeatedly using drones to target oil facilities, the heart of the country's economy and a source of 1/10 of the world's crude oil. But Saturday's attack hit deep within the country, proving the Houthis' ability to carry out increasingly sophisticated strikes and threatening to escalate tensions that are already inflamed in the Persian Gulf. Today's drone strikes could have an effect on oil prices, but that depends on how badly the sites were damaged. Rina, the Saudis say Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman received a phone call from President Trump, saying attacks like this could have a negative impact on the economy in the U.S. and around the world.
Roxana Saberi in London.
President, what sort of complications does the Russian involvement now pose?
Russia has to get out. What's your next question?
The US president has waded into hostilities in the Middle East, warning Russia, Syria and Iran to stop the carnage. He claims Turkey is working to stop the onslaught, which has displaced thousands, but that could bring troubles of its own.
Near the Turkish border with Syria, American troops are gone, but the fighting remains. Russian-backed Syrian forces roll through the Idlib province as hundreds of thousands flee. In makeshift shelters, those families now ponder what's next. We were sitting at night, this man says, and suddenly we were hit by missiles during the night. 10,000 kilometres away from his resort in Florida, Donald Trump tweeting, Russia, Syria and Iran are killing or on their way to killing thousands of innocent civilians. Don't do it. Turkey is working hard to stop this carnage. The US had cleared the way for Turkish occupation of northern Syria. The worry now that NATO-backed Turkish forces and Russian-backed Syrian troops come into conflict.
In other news, China, Russia and Iran are set to hold joint naval drills in the Gulf of Oman. Beijing says the drills will begin tomorrow and last till Monday. It says they are aimed at deepening exchange and cooperation between their navies. This comes amid heightened tensions between the US and Iran. Both sides have been at loggerheads since Washington reimposed sanctions on Tehran last year after withdrawing from a landmark nuclear deal. And there's also been months of tension between China and the US over trade and what Beijing calls US interference in its internal affairs, for instance, the situation in Hong Kong. Lynette Lim has more.
We understand it's the first such trilateral exercise, and while Iran would be keen to position the drills as a message to the world, that they have friends, they have allies, China is a bit more cautious about doing that, and in fact they're likely to limit their involvement to their non-combat anti-piracy, anti-terrorism naval forces. That's because China is unwilling to be drawn into the Iran-US conflict, and what essentially China wants is to be able to showcase their destroyer, the Xi, in these naval drills, and to also potentially sell weapons to Iran. So there's an economic aspect, there's a geopolitical power rebalancing aspect, and obviously China is the world's largest importer of crude oil. It wants to diversify this crude oil sources from Russia and Saudi Arabia to also Iran, and in participating in these drills, it's also signaling to the world that it wants to protect these waterways, which is essentially China's lifeline to the Middle Eastern oil.
Near Kirkuk on Friday, that killed a U.S. contractor and wounded several American and Iraqi troops.
What we did was take a decisive response that makes clear what President Trump has said for months and months and months, which is that we will not stand for the Islamic Republic of Iran to take actions that put American men and women in jeopardy.
The U.S. says Kataib Hezbollah receives aid and support from Iran that it uses to attack its forces. Some 5,000 U.S. troops are deployed in Iraq to fight the Islamic State group, but the U.S. increasingly considers Iran-backed militias a more significant threat. Iraq is close to both the US and Iran and has increasingly been caught in the middle of their growing tensions. Iraqi Prime Minister Adel Abdul Mahdi made no public comment on Friday's militia attack, but did condemn the US's retaliatory strike, calling it a dangerous escalation that threatens the security of Iraq and the region.
Pentagon confirming that Iran has launched a series of ballistic missiles targeting American forces in Iraq. Let's go to NBC's Richard Engel right now. He is in Iraq with the latest. What can you tell us, Richard?
Well, Iran has confirmed that it has launched what is a conventional strike, firing, it says, more than a dozen ballistic missiles from inside Iranian territory at bases that house American personnel here in Iraq. The U.S. military says that 2 bases were targeted. The Al-Assad base, which is in western Iraq, about 200 miles from the Iranian border, and here in Erbil, where I am right now. We heard what seemed like 2 explosions, and there are helicopters in the sky right now patrolling the area. Iran is not just claiming responsibility for this. It says that the operation was codenamed Martyr Soleimani. So it says this is a direct response to the U.S. targeted killing of the top Iranian general, Qasem Soleimani. The Iranian news agencies have also put out video. They want the world to know.
The Kremlin's decision not to agree to production cuts led the Saudis to massively increase their production, which sent oil prices plummeting. And this came as a huge hit to U.S. producers, many of whom can't make a profit at these low prices. Now, let's bring in former Shell Oil President John Hofmeister. He's on the phone with us. So, John, you think this was a direct attack by Putin against our successful oil producers? Make your case.
Yes, Putin is very angry at the success of the United States, plus compounded by the sanctions that the U.S. has placed upon him. Now, he's also intolerant of a crown prince half his age telling him what he should be doing with OPEC. So Putin's on his own here, and he's not afraid to challenge the United States shale industry, nor is he afraid to embarrass the crown prince of Saudi Arabia. So we're in for a pretty rough time in the coming months.
John, question for you. We've seen an awful lot of these oil price wars in the past. One thing that has not changed is that Russia is very dependent on oil revenues. 40% of their budget is from oil and gas exports. How can they really survive with all the tensions in Russia right now, the need to up social programs, et cetera? Can they really stick this out for several months?
I think they can for several months, but not for much longer than that, because you're right. They do need the oil revenues for much of their national income, but not as much as Saudi Arabia.
True.
Saudi Arabia is even more dependent on those revenues to keep the state running and to provide all the subsidies to the Saudi Arabian people that the oil produces.
In the day's other news, the U.S. Justice Department announced indictments of Venezuela's president, Nicolas Maduro, and his top allies on charges of narco-terrorism. Attorney General William Barr said they conspired to flood the U.S. with cocaine and to loot their own country of billions of dollars.
Maduro and his other defendants have betrayed the Venezuelan people and corrupted Venezuela's institutions. While the Venezuelan people suffer, this cabal lines their pockets with drug money and the proceeds of their corruption. And this has to come to an end.
The Trump administration has been trying to oust Maduro since his disputed re-election in 2018.
The Navy, the British Navy, has completed a concentrated operation to shadow Russian warships after unusually high levels of activity in the English Channel and the North Sea. What do you know about that?
Yes, this is an interesting development and really underlines concerns that are being raised by senior officials about how this coronavirus pandemic across the world is a huge distraction for governments and could potentially be exploited by adversaries. And that's why, while you've got up to 20,000 military personnel on standby to help the government in its COVID-19 response, you've also got preparations underway to ensure that critical military operations, such as the one you've just described with the Royal Navy shadowing Russian vessels off the coast, so that they are able to continue. It's not just the naval operations, it's also the RAF being able to scramble fast jets to patrol the skies. It's also the counter-terrorism forces that are able to mobilise in the event of any kind of terrorist attacks.
This information is coming from random actors around the world, but often, too, coming from places like the Chinese Communist Party, from Russia, from Iran. Those are nations that want to undermine what we're doing here, our democracy, our freedom, the way that we're responding to this.
With the world distracted by coronavirus, Vladimir Putin has been consolidating his power for years to come. He's been Russia's leader for 2 decades. In that time, he's created a system that looks like a democracy, but lacks any real opposition. The problem is, when his current presidential term ends in 2024, the Constitution bars him from running again. His solution? Change the Constitution. First, in January, Putin called for constitutional amendments to supposedly make Russia stronger and more democratic. But then in March, he revealed the real reason for the changes: to reset the presidential term limit, which would let him run again and stay in power up to 2036. Putin's critics called a protest against his power grab. By then, Russia had been reporting coronavirus infections for more than a week. Hours after the protest was called, Moscow banned mass gatherings. Instead, people have been protesting on their own.
Смотрите, сейчас, благодаря коронавирусу, Путин и вся его команда может запрещать нам собираться все вместе, устраивать митинги.
Some have even started uploading pictures of themselves, holding signs at home.
Понятное дело, что таким образом он сможет оставаться у власти как можно дольше, а это противоречит всем принципам нормального мира.
On March 11th, the World Health Organization declared a pandemic.
4,291 people have lost their lives.
That same day, the Russian parliament passed Putin's constitutional changes. Not one single member voted against it.
Закон одобрен, коллеги, в третьем чтении.
But coronavirus is holding up his victory lap. A nationwide vote on the constitutional changes to show that the public supports him. The vote was originally planned for April, on the 150th birthday of communist leader Vladimir Lenin. But Putin postponed it until the situation with the pandemic improves.
Только опираясь на профессиональное мнение, рекомендации врачей, специалистов, примем решение о новом дне голосования.
Either way, this vote is purely symbolic. For one, Putin's still popular here. A recent survey showed 57% of Russians would vote for him again. About the same number said they'd vote for the constitutional amendments.
Ну, всю жизнь, царь всю жизнь был это самое, пожизненно.
А почему?
Потому что всегда было так.
And even if the public voted against them, it wouldn't be legally binding anyway. Whatever happens, he's removed the last obstacle to staying in charge until he's 83. At this rate, he could be in power for longer than even Joseph Stalin.